Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Jolene by Dolly Parton is one of the greatest country songs ever recorded. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. It's been covered by hundreds of artists, featured on lots of best song ever lists, and most importantly, almost 50 years after its release, all I have to do to get you to sing the chorus in your head is say the name Jolene. It's an enduring classic, and a lot of that comes from its incredibly relatable story. Even if you've never had someone try to steal your romantic partner, everyone's experienced the feeling of having something you love slip through your fingers when there was nothing you could do to stop it. But as strong as the lyrics are, Jolene is more than a poem. It's a song, and I think the music deserves some credit too. Let's take it apart. Normally I'd start at the beginning of the piece, but this time I'm gonna skip ahead and take a look at the chord progression instead. There's only one for the entire song, and it starts like this. Harmonically, this is deceptively interesting. I'd compare it to the classic 1-4-5 progression, which I'm sure you've heard a million times. In that progression, each chord is doing a very specific job. The 1 chord is your home bass, the 4 chord makes things unstable, and the 5 chord is directional, setting up a resolution back to 1. It's an extremely strong, satisfying progression because every chord does exactly what it's supposed to do. In minor, though, these functions get kinda blurry. The list of jobs was built for the major scale, but minor as a whole is darker and less stable, so a lot of the chords wind up sounding ambiguous. Instead of having one clearly defined function, each chord kind of fits into a couple different roles depending on context. Like, take the Jolene progression. We start on 1 minor, then go to flat 3. Flat 3 can behave like 4, creating instability, but it can also behave like 1, extending our sense of rest. Likewise, flat 7 can be directional like 5, but it can also be generically unstable like 4. This means that in one interpretation, the Jolene progression is doing the exact same thing. 1 minor, flat 3, flat 7 is a minor version of 1-4-5, because the two progressions use the same set of functions in the same order. But it's also not. Using these minor substitutions means all our functions are weakened, so we get the same motion, but the impact is a lot more subtle. You get your harmonic rise and fall, but the effect is more like a ripple than a tidal wave. That gentle, drifting resolution is also emphasized by the structure. It's a 4-chord phrase, and the last chord is 1 minor again, so by the time the phrase is over, we've already resolved. In a more musically active song, you might expect to end on something unstable to keep the motion going, but Jolene is not an active song. It's passive. The whole point is that Jolene, not Parton, is in control. The preemptive resolution is an act of harmonic submission. It says long before Parton does that if, after all this, Jolene does decide to take her man, she knows there's nothing she can do to stop her. From there we get the second half of the progression, which is even simpler. It's just that same flat 7 to 1 resolution again, but drawn out so each chord takes twice as long. This sudden drop in harmonic rhythm lets us really absorb the soft, mild resolution they're playing without the frantic energy of the first half. In the context of the song, it feels almost like an apology, like Parton felt she was coming off too desperate, so she's backing off to something even less aggressive. That's kind of it for the harmony, and that's not surprising. These days, I think many people associate the phrase 3 chords and the truth with punk, but it was originally used by songwriter Harlan Howard to describe country music, and Jolene is a testament to its power. Sure, Parton could have dressed this whole thing up with all sorts of fancy chords, but would that have made it better? I don't think so. The beauty of Jolene is in its naked honesty. It's a window into an emotion we've all felt but no one wants to talk about, and the thing about windows is they work best if you can see right through them. These 3 chords are enough to tell the story. Anything more would have just gotten in the way. Anyway, next I want to talk about the melody.
Jolene, 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 Jolene.
And I'll get the obvious out of the way first. This is an ascending line. The notes are going up. Mind-blowing stuff, I know, but I mention it because when you have an ascending melody, especially one that's this relentless, it can build up a lot of tension. With each repetition of Jolene's name, you can feel that rising desperation in Parton's voice, begging her to take pity and leave. Slightly less obvious, though, is that the melody is pentatonic. That is, it's sticking exclusively to the 5 most consonant notes in the minor scale. The other notes, the 2 and the flat 6, are each a half step away from a note in the 1 chord. This makes them less pleasant to sit on, so pentatonic melodies tend to sound cleaner. They're pretty common, especially in country, so it's not surprising to see one here, but keep this in mind, it'll come up again later. Back to the desperation though, I think most listeners would agree that a lot of that comes specifically from the final Jolene, and they do a bunch of different things to help make that moment really land. For starters, it's the top of our ascending melody, which means it's carrying all the tension from all the previous parts, but more than that, it's a pretty big leap. So far we've been moving by step or occasionally thirds, slowly increasing the temperature, but here we jump straight from F sharp to B, then up to C sharp from there.
Jolene.
This spans more distance in 3 notes than we saw in the rest of the line. It's a sudden outburst of melodic energy, but it doesn't stick. Once she hits C sharp, she glides back down to G sharp, the 5th, a step above the F sharp we jumped off of, resigning back to the general shape of the melody. But that's just notes. Let's talk rhythm. The first 3 Jolenes follow the same pattern. She sings lean on the beat and Jo in 8th note before it.
Jolene, Jolene, Jolene.
This accents the 2nd syllable, which fits with how the name is pronounced. It all feels very natural. But on the last one, when she jumps up to B, she hits the first syllable early so that it also falls on a beat.
Jolene.
She hangs on that Jo for longer, increasing the accent on it, shifting from Jolene to more of a Jolene. That change in stress makes this iteration stand out from the others, and in context feels like Parton is almost wailing out the name here. And the final trick actually takes place after she's done singing. They add in what I like to call a breath bar, which is an extra bar of music outside the normal metric structure that gives you a chance to catch your breath, or in this case it's actually only half a bar, but the principle is the same.
I'm begging of you, please don't take.
And to be clear, when I say it lets you catch your breath, I mean you, the listener. Parton could have easily sung through this line without stopping,
I'm begging of you, please don't take.
But the breath bar inserts a pause in the music to allow you to reflect on what you just heard. It lets her final plea for Jolene's attention hang in the air for a moment before we get to her specific request. From there we get the second half of the melody,
I'm begging of you, please don't take my man,
where she walks back down to the root. This has the same sort of apology vibe that the chords have, trying to undo the tension caused by the walk-up. It's almost entirely over that B chord, and it sticks to chord tones, which means she spends the second half of the bar on D sharp. That may not seem particularly noteworthy, but remember, up to now the melody's been exclusively pentatonic. D sharp breaks that, adding in a new sort of dissonance that wants to be resolved. But it gets even better. In a song as simple as Jolene, a lot of the beauty comes from the way these musical elements interact with the story. If this D sharp is creating dissonance, then the question we need to ask is, what is that dissonance saying? And in the chorus at least, the words she's singing on it are "don't take." That's a powerful message, arguably the central thesis of the entire song. She drives it home by leaving the pentatonic scale to make absolutely certain Jolene is listening, and after the line is done, she even tosses in another full breath bar to give Jolene as much time as possible to really think about her plea. She's not leaving anything to chance. That's the chorus, and if we switch over to the verse, it's pretty similar. There are a couple differences though, most of which have to do with the walk-up. For starters, it's busier. Compare this,
Jolene, Jolene,
with 4 syllables, to this,
your beauty is beyond compare,
with 8 in the same amount of time. This makes it a bit more conversational and allows Parton to give us more details. It also just makes it feel like a new section. If she'd kept using the same phrasing, there'd be almost no distinction between them, and the song would get repetitive. Switching things up keeps the music interesting. The next change also helps with that. In the verses, she doesn't do the big leap to the high C sharp. Instead, she just steps up to G sharp,
with flaming locks of auburn hair,
which keeps things a little more calm. And finally, she drops the breath bar in the middle, running straight from that G sharp into the walk down.
Flaming locks of auburn hair with ivory skin and eyes of emerald.
That's because, unlike in the chorus, the first half isn't really a complete thought here. She's not trying to tell you about Jolene's auburn hair, that's just part of a larger point. We do still get the breath bar at the end of each line, though, to give each statement a greater sense of narrative weight. And there's one other change in the verse, but it's not in the melody, it's in the bass. In the chorus, during the fast chord section, the bass is playing roots like you'd expect. But in the verse, under the B chord, they play a D sharp instead. This puts the chord in an inversion, which just means the lowest note isn't the root, and that softens the sense of function even further. It's still the flat 7 chord, but it's harder to tell what it's trying to do. It's a really subtle touch, but it helps keep the verse feeling distinct and interesting on its own. So, okay, that's the harmony and the melody, so are we done? Did we analyze the song? Not quite. In order to really understand Jolene, we have to talk about orchestration. They're constantly adding and removing instruments to keep things fresh, and while I don't want to go through every single change, actually, you know what? It's a short song, let's do it. The song starts with an acoustic guitar along with bass and drums. It's such a simple arrangement, but it's got this powerful driving rhythm to it. Part of that comes from the beautiful finger-picking pattern by Chip Young. The way it stops and starts throughout the bar keeps you engaged, and his use of D sharp at the top of the chord voicing gives it this haunting, almost hollow effect that really amps up the sense of longing. Another part comes from the rock-solid rhythm section. They're keeping it fairly simple, but the kick pattern especially really drives this section forward. The secret ingredient, though, is the second acoustic guitar. Didn't realize there was one? Don't worry, most people don't, but if you listen closely to the left side of the mix, there's this quiet quiet, rapid strumming right on the edge of hearing. Here, I'll crank it up a bit. It gives the intro a frantic energy that's hard to locate a reason for, ramping up your anxiety to put you in the narrator's shoes. That arrangement keeps going into the chorus with the addition of Parton's vocals.
Jolene, Jolene.
And because this song relies so heavily on story, I think it's worth talking about the decision to start on the chorus. Different song sections serve different narrative roles. Verses tend to describe the events of the story, while choruses paint an emotional landscape telling you how to feel about those events. By leading with the chorus then, Jolene tells us that we're not really here for the details, you're supposed to focus on the pain. From there, the second half of the chorus gives us a huge gear shift. First, the second guitar switches to playing arpeggios as well.
Jolene, Jolene.
And then halfway through, we ramp up even more with the addition of background vocals.
Jolene, Jolene.
It's a sudden, thunderous eruption of musical energy that takes the desperation we were already feeling and cranks it up to 11. From there, we get the verse where the background vocals drop out, replaced with a fiddle.
Beauty is beyond compare with
It's pretty quiet while Parton is singing, but during the breath bar it makes its presence known,
green.
giving us a bit of a counterline to complement the vocals with a new sound. The fiddle line becomes sort of a musical embodiment of the verse, a sort of release valve for the tension that the chorus just lets us sit in. From there, we add in a hand percussion part that I think is just tapping on the body of a guitar. This, again, is panned to the left, and it starts out small and quiet,
Talks about you in his sleep, and there's nothing I can do to keep.
but as the verse goes on, it gets louder and busier,
And I can easily understand.
creating an energetic ramp that lifts us back up into the chorus. The second half of the verse also starts to melt away that fiddle part. In the first breath bar, we get a faint echo of it,
Jolene,
and by the second, it's barely there at all.
Jolene.
This brings us back to the chorus, and here I'm not hearing any new instruments, but it's still pretty exciting because they've ramped up the dynamics. Everyone's playing louder.
Jolene, Jolene.
In the second half, we get the background vocals again,
Jolene, Jolene.
and then it all fades into a quieter verse,
You could have your choice of men, but I could never love again.
where the fiddle is gone entirely, leaving us stewing in tension once again. That builds up to the final chorus,
Jolene, Jolene.
and hey, look who's back, it's our old friend the fiddle. It might be hard to hear under the vocals, so here it is in the breath bar too.
My man. Jolene.
It's migrated from the descriptive verses to the emotional choruses, blending the two sections in what feels to me like a sense of acceptance, or at least resignation. Parton's outlined all the ways Jolene could take her man, and that's it. It's gonna be what it's gonna be. It's out of her hands. This is even reflected in the lyrics. Instead of the accusatory line, "Don't take him just because you can," she switches to the more passive, "Don't take him even though you can." She knows she's lost, and the fiddle's there to play her out. The last thing we get is a fade out on the intro with this haunting vocal fill, moving from D sharp, which is again dissonant, down to B sharp, which isn't even in the key, before sliding into C sharp one final time. And that's pretty much it. Jolene is one of those songs that endures on the strength of its story, but it also shows just how much of a role music can play in telling that story. These same words would sound very different with a different melody, and even though it's just 3 chords, it's the right 3 chords. Simplicity in music often gets a bad rap, but most of my favorite songs are simple. There's an artistry to simpleness that gets lost when you try to do too much. If Dolly Parton had been afraid to stick to 3 chords and the truth, we never would have got Jolene, and I for one am glad we did. Anyway, thanks for watching. As always, this song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. And because this is YouTube, I have to ask you to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.